Well, I'm very excited to be here, and we'll just take a brief moment to give our audience an overview of food safety tech, and then we can get right into Jorge's presentation. But again, for those people who might not know who I am, I'm the founder of Innovative Publishing. We publish 3 online trade journals and do conferences in each of the industries that we serve. We publish Food Safety Tech, is what's up on the screen. We publish something called Medical MedTech Intelligence, which covers the medical device industry, and we recently launched a new journal called the Cannabis Industry Journal, addressing safety and quality issues in the legal cannabis industry. Just move on. Food Safety Tech. This is an online trade journal, so we don't print anything. All the content lives at foodsafetytech.com. This was a screenshot from this morning that our headline was the Dole Listeria investigation that came out last week. This really is the next generation of business-to-business trade journals. It allows readers to read on the fly, from their phones, from their computers. The best way to get the content is delivered in your inbox. There's a red button up here, which is our subscription for the newsletter that comes out, and the gold button right underneath that is the most current issue of our newsletter. And we publish about 7 to 8 original articles each week that are either originally written by our editorial staff or contributed by industry experts. The articles themselves then dive deep into a specific topic. In this case, this was a article that was contributed by Alchemy Systems, and as you can see, it's very current even to today's topic that Jorge will be covering. In addition to publishing Food Safety Tech, we do several conferences allied to the industry. One coming up later this month, in the end of the month, in St. Paul, Minnesota, is a Listeria Detection and Control Workshop, which is 2 full days diving deep into the aspects of Listeria. And we'll have a focus on the dairy industry, produce industry, and then a separate track for the sort of the rest of the industry. Very hands-on. It's, again, diving deep into this subject, and that's available, more information on foodsafetytech.com. In addition to that, we have our annual conference that we do, and is coming up to our 4th year in this, where we've worked with both SQF and Jorge, called the Food Safety Consortium. It takes place in Schaumburg, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, not far from O'Hare. We've been in the same facility now for 3 years. It's a week-long event with pre-conference workshops and training on Monday and Tuesday of that week. The conference itself is Wednesday and Thursday with post-conference workshops on Friday. We host Stop Foodborne Illness as a charity event, fundraiser event that was very successful last year. It was actually a lot of fun. We have about 50 or so exhibitors with tabletops, and it's very, very education intensive. And again, Jorge has been playing a big role in that, and again, as is SQF. Some of the sponsors that we had last year kind of range from service providers to equipment providers. And last year, 2 of our keynotes were Mike Taylor from FDA and Frank Yanis from Walmart. And a few other folks that came last year. Again, we're expecting the same type of level of speakers this year. Information will be at foodsafetyconsortium.com, .org. And actually, let me just put that up for everyone again. It's foodsafetyconsortium.org. And I did want to announce to this audience that we are looking we'll be doing a call for abstracts looking for presentations that will be posted to this website. There'll be a link to that in about a week and a half to 2 weeks. So let's just say May 15th will be a link looking for abstracts for the consortium. And again, lastly, want to thank everyone at SQF for the opportunity to sponsor this presentation, and again, invite everyone, if you're not already getting the newsletter, to subscribe to the newsletter at that red button at foodsafetytech.com. So now, let me introduce Jorge Hernandez. And Leslie, I believe you're going to switch over the presentation. There we go. Okay, great. Jorge Hernandez is the Chief Food Safety Officer at Wholesome International, responsible for the design and implementation of food safety, quality assurance, regulatory compliance, and sustainability programs. Wholesale International is a restaurant company with different concepts and brands in the quick service and fast casual food service markets. Jorge was previously the Senior Vice President of Food Safety and Quality Assurance at U.S. Foods, Vice President of Food Safety and Risk Management at the National Restaurant Association, and Regional Supervisor at the Illinois Department of Public Health. Jorge received a B.S. degree in biology from Rockford University, a degree in microbiology from the Centro de Estudios Médico-Biológicos in Mexico City, Mexico, and a degree in languages and literature from the Université de la Sorbonne in Paris, France, and belongs to several national and international organizations and boards like the Global Food Safety Initiative, Stop Foodborne Illness. Jorge is an editorial advisor for Food Safety Tech and an advisor for the Food Safety Consortium. Also, the International Food Protection Institute, Food Safety Summit, QA Magazine, and ANSI Accreditation Committee. And I'd like to turn things over to Jorge.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate the introduction. And on this day, May the 4th, be with you. And with the rest of our attendees, good morning, everybody. I hope you're having a good day wherever you are, or good afternoon. Today's agenda is to talk about food safety and quality distribution. But before I start, I want to let you know that when we put together the presentation, we were going to include food safety and food quality and distribution because we were unsure when the FDA was going to release the Safe Food Transportation Act Final Rules. Since that time, they have done so. So we pivot a little bit and tailor the remarks mostly about just food safety. The reason for that is in the final version of the regulations of the rules, the FDA actually made a change and took all of the quality elements that were in the proposed rules, and that's no longer the case in the final rules. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. The idea today in this seminar is to talk a little bit about how is FSMA going to affect the food safety and distribution in the United States, how SQF compares with the Sanitary Food Transportation Act as a final rule, and then provide an industry perspective about how people in the different portions of the supply chain should be thinking about it. The bottom line is our thinking was that as you listen to this, you start getting an idea not only about what the regulation says, but how it's likely to impact you, whatever your play in the supply chain is. And more likely about where you need to start asking some questions either about your processes, your procedures, your contracts, or a lot of other areas, so that then, based on your particular segment of the industry and your particular operations, you can start digging up and start making decisions and perhaps making some changes or increasing the area of documentation, for example, in some of the parts of your operations, in preparation for when the rule gets enacted and you are likely to get a visit from our friends in the FDA. The other part of it, and towards the second part of the presentation, is if you're already certified in SQF, or if you're thinking of getting certified in SQF here, what are the things that you should be looking at? How is this going to impact you? And what is the things that you should be start thinking about either increasing or doing a little bit different to make sure that you maintain your program, you maintain the ticket to your program, yet again, you meet with the regulations as released a couple of weeks ago. With all of that, you get a little bit of the industry perspective based on the last 11 years working for one of the second largest distributor of foods in the United States, but also for the National Restaurant Association and as a regulator the previous 10 years in the implementations on how rules work and how the impact of the expected interpretations are likely to probably affect some of the things you may or may not be doing. So with that in mind, let's start. First part, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about FSMA and the Sanitary Food Transportation Act. But it would like you to think about it, that the Sanitary Food Transportation Act is just one of the 7 major FSMA rules. This is important because the framework that the FDA has developed for this rule layers on top of each other. What does that mean? That means that it's not just an industry segment that is affected for it, but actually it plays with different parts of the segment. Depending on how you operate, you are affected. You're likely to be affected by 2, 3, or 4 different parts of the rules. So when you think of sanitary food transportation, which is the focus of today, you also may be affected, for example, for preventive controls, or you may be affected for produce safety, for supply verification, and those work together and layer on top of each other, and don't is not a unique thing where your only one rule is designed for your segment in the industry anymore. So that's very important to note. The other part, as I mentioned, as I go over the presentation and you think about this new rule, you got to remember that the food defense rule is also going to have an impact on the transportation of the food across the United States. We don't know to what level, but we expect that there will be yet another layer that we would have to comply as these rules get released and then they get implemented. The Sanitary Transportation Rule was released a month ago, April 6th, and we are now looking at some of the things that are in the rule and some of the things that we expect that the FDA announced and that I'll mention a little bit later. Here is the actual registered published number and date in case that you need to go and actually look at it and read it yourself. It's a very good thing to go. Now, what is interesting at this rule from the industry perspective is that the FDA decided to take a little bit of a different approach that at least I have not seen for a while, and they decided that in the regulations we're going to make it activity-based within the industry. What does that mean? That we're going to put specific requirements of different activities that happen during the transportation of food. And for that, they define shippers, loaders, receivers, and carriers specifically about what they do within the chain and what are the responsibilities to carry on. This becomes very, very important. For those of you who have been following the rule from the beginning and the earlier versions, in the proposed versions, there is a new definition, and that's loaders. I'll explain a little bit more in depth later, but this new activity-based perspective that they took does make sense that they put this new function that is very important as how food gets distributed in the United States. And again, the rule is engaged in transportation operations of food and applies to all intra as well as interstate transportation of food by motor or rail. It applies to, and this is very, very important, temperature control foods for safety, TCS. Foods not completely enclosed by a container, and animal food. It includes pet, animal feed, raw materials, and ingredients. From the onset, we can see where the focus of the risk that the FDA perceives in this segment and what they wanted attention to be paid as far as the regulation goes. Now, the rule exempts the foods regulated already by USDA, food that is completely enclosed by a container that is not necessarily temperature controlled for safety. So cans, crackers, or things of that sort, if that's all you do, you actually are exempted by the rule. Compressed foods and food gases, food contact surfaces as defined by the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, human food byproducts for use as animal food without further processing, and live food animals except mollusk and shellfish. More on that a little bit later. So to get into the guts of the rule, the definitions become very important. As I said, these are activity-based, and the first one would be a shipper. They define a shipper as a person, whether it's a manufacturer or a freight broker. Pay attention, those of you guys who have logistics segments of your business, who arranges for the transportation of food in the United States by a carrier or multiple carriers sequentially. It also defines a carrier as the person who actually physically moves the food, either by rail or motor vehicle, in commerce within the United States. Does not include any person who transports food while operating as a parcel or delivery service. That's definitely exempted for this rule. Loader, that's the new definition that is included in this rule, and that's the person that loads food into a motor or rail vehicle during transport operations. This becomes very important because a lot of food companies will need more than one definition. Remember what I said earlier, this is activity-based, and it becomes a little bit complicated because companies, depending, for those especially who have multiple locations, may have different definitions applied to different locations depending on the type of business that they have. In some instances, for example, a distributor or maybe a transporter, maybe a loader, maybe the carrier. In other words, the same company may act as a receiver in other parts of the operation. Yet again, in another facility in a different part of the country, they may have a different company who does the loading for them, so they're going to have some specific requirements in how they agree in the responsibilities for the loader as defined by the FDA going to be carried out. So it becomes a little bit more complex to try to look at the business from the activity base for companies that play different roles at different times and even within one facility or with different facilities. Very, very interesting. So what does it require for these people? Well, when you look at the rule as a whole, it's actually very simple and makes a lot of sense. It's very, very much common sense. Vehicles and equipment must be cleanable and suitable to prevent food from becoming unsafe during transportation operations. Very, very straightforward. It's what, the vehicles and the equipment must be maintained in sanitary condition. They must be designed, maintained, and equipped to provide adequate temperature control, and the food must be stored in a manner that prevents pests. Seems like very straightforward. The operation of those vehicles, applies to all parties of the role that we combine, and this is what I'm talking about now. Depending on what role you're going to play, sometimes in a specific shipment or a specific lane that you may be operating may have different responsibilities, and this is where it becomes a little bit more complex for the industry. Responsibilities may be reassigned to written agreements and contract. Now, every time that there is an agreement, for example, a company is going to use something and they're going to use another carrier or another truck to carry that load to another location, there must be a written agreement. The watch out here from the industry perspective is that now that agreement and that record becomes subject to inspection. So that's something that is going to have to be watched out in how they get executed, so that if you want something that it does not become subject to inspection or subject to a record requirement from the FDA, it may have to be separated somehow so that you don't have to give the entire contracts to the regulatory authority if that's something that your organization doesn't choose to do. After all, the goal is to prevent food from becoming unsafe during transportation. And they give us some examples, prevent contamination of raw foods and non-foods by segregation, isolation, and packaging. Very important. Requires hand washing to protect food in bulk vehicles or open containers. And again, the temperature control of those foods that require temperature control for safety. The conditions depend on the type of food, animal feed, pet food, human food, and products in the product stage in the manufacturer process. Now, the regulation also allows for companies that have what they call common integrated written procedures. You may have a procedure that you may use in multiple facilities, and that would be acceptable. They can be used for shippers, receivers, loaders, and carriers under the ownership or operational control of a single legal entity. This is for the companies that have more than one location. It allows for be able to have one set of common standards that can be applied multiple. However, the complexity becomes where that company plays different roles in different locations, as I said earlier. This applies to the sections of requirements for shippers, receivers, and carriers, and the written procedures are subject to the record requirements. Again, if a company decides the corporate requirements for the entire organization, those SOPs, those standard operating procedures, or those practices of documents become subject to inspection. So this is something that the company is going to have to assess to ensure that they feel comfortable given the portions that will meet this requirement without revealing other information, other practices that may be proprietary in nature or may be not willing to be subject to FOIA requirements, Freedom of Information Act, to become public. This is where companies are going to have to make some very defined rules about what is in their standard operating procedures and how they communicate in standards, because once you show them that they're part of your requirements to meet this regulation, then they become subject to inspection, and they can have them as part of the inspection process. This is an interesting provision. The regulations have an additional provision that makes them very interesting. Now, the FDA requires the requirement to stop the sale or distribution of food if the shipper, the loader, the person who puts it in the truck, the receiver or carrier becomes aware of, quote, an indication of a possible material failure of temperature control or other condition that may render the food unsafe during transportation. They are required to take appropriate action, communicate with the other parties, unless that the food is determined to be safe by a qualified individual. In my experience with the food industry, it is very often that if the receiver finds a product that doesn't meet the specifications, and this may be an issue that may render the food unsafe, it is common to just reject it. That would no longer seem to be appropriate, because now they become aware of something that may be unsafe. Now they're required to take an action and inform the other ones. So that's an area that even the FDA, in the release of the rules, said they will provide a lot more explanation and interpretation, but their expectation is that if any actor within the food distribution, transportation chain becomes aware of food unsafe, they are not required to stop that food from reaching the market and being used. Something we have not seen before, and from public health makes sense, but it's going to cause a little bit of has the potential to cause a little bit of disruption within the industry. So we're going to have to think very carefully and long about how those laws and how those contracts and how that information gets shared, who makes the decision, and how that decisions are documented so they can provide that information to the regulators when they come. Shippers must specify in writing to the carrier, and if appropriate, loaders, the conditions for the sanitary specifications of the vehicle and equipment. This includes designing the specifications for cleaning procedures, sanitary conditions, temperature requirements, including pre-cooling. This can be done one time with written notification if the information does not change, but then again, all of those, whether it's in the procedures, in the part of the process, or part of the contract, become subject to the records. Now, what is interesting is the carrier or the loader must accept that responsibility in writing. If you tell a carrier or loader that you're not required to check temperature to ensure that the cleaning is to prevent contamination or cross-contamination of products, the carrier or the loader must accept that responsibility, and you need to be able to show that how that was accepted, because it's part of the regulation. Loaders, this is the person who put the product into the rail car or into the truck. Determining specific requirements for containers not completely enclosed to avoid contamination and evaluate condition of pests. This is something that the industry has been doing for a long time, and now it is a requirement that has to be documented. Must verify the temperature requirements and conditions of refrigerated storage, which makes sense. except that now this person is required to maintain all that documentation available, and this must be provided upon inspection. And then the receivers. The receivers, upon receiving the temperature control for safety food, they must take steps to adequately assess that the food was not subject to significant temperature abuse, such as determine the food's temperature, the ambient temperature of the vehicle, and its temperature settings, and conduct sensory, for example, sensory inspection to make sure that there is no off odors. So basically, the receivers are required to actually make sure the food that they're receiving is relatively safe. And they must have the process and procedures and documentation to verify that they've been doing that. Again, something that becomes subject to inspection. Carriers, this is actually the persons and the vehicles that carry the product, are going to be, depending on the written agreements, are responsible for, and remember I said, are responsible for equipment, meet the specifications to prevent the food from becoming unsafe during transportation. If requested, provide the temperature and demonstrate the temperature conditions were maintained by any way agreed to the shipper, how the temperature was going to be maintained. Identify the previous cargo for bulk containers and information on the most recent cleaning. Have written procedures on sanitary conditions of vehicles and equipment, transportation control, and bulk vehicle requirement. Okay? And again, only applies when the written agreement is in place between the shipper and the carrier. It identifies the carrier as responsible for these activities. It's going to be interesting if a carrier refuses to take responsibility, how would that be handled? Because now they're taking the responsibility, now they become subject to the rules. So that's going to be an interesting implementation that we're going to have to go through. Training. Now, if you're training, you're also not required to be trained. I mean, if you're a carrier, you're required to provide adequate training for all the personnel engaged into transportation. And the training is very basic. It's going to be about the potential for safety problems that can happen, the basic sanitary transportation practices, and the responsibility that you are assuming and you agree to assume for that load of food. The training is required to be upon hiring as needed. The part that is going to be interesting is that you need to have the training records. It includes the date, the type of training, and the name of the person trained. Again, for companies that own the whole thing, it's going to be relatively easy depending on the number of drivers that they have. But the companies that have the habit of use third parties, logistic companies, or other, and then they're going to have to provide not only the documentation of the trainer of the vehicle that they use and all of the things that are already referred that they agree to take advantage, take responsibility for, but also the person who drives the truck that had the appropriate training. It starts to becoming a little bit more complex in how this is going to be handled by the industry in an efficient manner, especially because there is some very strong regulations of how fast the documentation needs to be available for inspection. Good thinking, and it's going to require some good implementation by all of the players to make sure that the information is available for all the transportation of the food. And now we get to the records requirements, shippers and carriers. Again, I said it 4 or 5 times, and I'm going to say it one more time. Specific record requirements, written agreements, the portions that go against the compliance of this rule will be available for inspection. So they need to be able to be collected during inspection, reviewed during the inspection, or whatever. And so anything that is attached to them needs to be rethought by the industry, whether you wanted that to be part of the inspection process or not. So that's going to be, what I already said, is going to be very important to evaluate those processes and procedures. It allows a company to have intercompany single legal entity with written procedures, but those procedures must be available also to the regulatory agency. This is an interesting part of the rule. All records must be kept for 12 months beyond when the procedures are in use. Beyond when the procedures are in use. So if something happens today, then that's going to be 12 months past that when the procedures were in use. So that's going to be an interesting interpretation also to look for, because it may not be just 12 months on an average annual basis, but it may continue to extend for a longer period of time. So that's going to be interesting to see what the interpretation is here. All records are required to be available to the regulator upon oral or written notice. Carriers' written procedures must be on-site, but if off-site, they must be available within 24 hours. And this is where it's going to become a little bit more complex for the industry. And electronic records that are on-site, they're considered on-site if they're accessible on-site. They're talking pretty much about systems and computer systems that allow you to get that information. But as you can tell, there is going to be a little bit of complexity for those players within the industry that play different parts at different times to be able to document that each one of those parts that are required by law to have certain documentation can be available on-site within less than 24 hours. Okay. Waivers. There are some waivers. Transportation of grade A milk and milk products is not covered. And for retail, facilities that are under the jurisdiction of the Food Code and the transportation direct to consumers. The FDA announced that it's planning to issue a final rule on the waivers and a lot more details on this part of the rule. When it comes to compliance dates, the compliance date is 1 year from April 6th. So we have 11 months to be able to comply. Again, at the very basic level, it is something, the majority of the practice is already taking place, but how they're documented, and it's something that needs to be looked at, and how those records are going to be available, that's something that probably most companies are going to have to take another look. For small businesses, they have an extra year, and they're defined as non-motor carriers with less than 500 full-time employees, or with less than $27.5 million in annual receipt for food receipts a year. Okay, the FDA has been very, very open about this, and they said that they will be working to provide as much guidance and as much information before the effective date to ensure that the company complies as they envision or they intend it to be. They have what they call the Technical Assistance Network, and there is the website available. They stated they're going to put an online training course, which is currently under development. They expect it to be about an hour long, and they will be free of charge. Yet again, don't forget that the requirement is not about the course, but the documentation that every person who carries those loads has taken that course, the date and time of that course, etc. But they are already planning to put the course together themselves as an example of what they accept for compliance. And they are working on guidance documents that they said is in development of the expectations for compliance. So that's the first part of the presentation. To give you a look on now, what is the requirements? What are the things that the FDA expects? So the second part, I'm going to talk. Okay, so now we have a new world. I need to look at all of those things. But what happens if I have SQF? Okay, how does that affect me, or what are the things that I need to look at? To be fair, SQF just received the same information everybody did last year, and I am sure they're working very hard to provide additional interpretations to ensure that the folks that are certified under this scheme can facilitate the documentation, and they can facilitate the capture of the information that is going to be required by the law. So a lot of the information that I'm giving here, I'm just going to focus on the areas that if you are certified by the SQF, or if you're thinking or considering to be certified by SQF, you probably want to take a look at how you're doing, and you want to make sure that you feel comfortable on how those practices are being carried today. I'll move a little bit faster because we're running a little bit out of time, but as you guys know, this would be the SQF Model 12, Food Safety Fundamentals, Good Distribution Practices for Transport and Distribution of Food Products. This is the area that is more applicable to compliance with this rule. Now, all of these requirements of SQF are going to help meet the additional requirements of FSMA. They either are part of good manufacturer and distribution practices, or there are things that make food safe in different areas or in different portions of the food chain. But I will not discuss it here because this rule is very much targeted to the distribution part, to the transportation part, if you will. This has a lot to do with the buildings, the storage facilities, and other parts. So my focus of, for the next 10 to 15 minutes will be mostly on the ones that impact the transportation or can carry, depending on how you're implementing these practices in your operation, can carry an impact to the transportation, either because you're a shipper, a loader, or a receiver within the meaning of the new regulation. Okay, and this is what I'm talking about: the premises and maintenance of equipment. The reason why I focus on this one is because as it becomes important to load that truck and unload that truck, now you're going to have that documentation very, very strong, that you have taken into consideration the products that you're carrying, the risk, food safety risk, temperature control. One of the things that the rule, and I think I forgot to mention, is they want you to consider cross-contamination with allergens as a risk also. So you need to look at the risk of the products that you carry, the packaging and equipment, to ensure that all of those risks are managed. Okay, that's very, very important. So it's about equipment, it's about practices, but it's also about how you ensure that your staff and contractors observe the practices that are going to make sure that the products don't get contaminated during the loading or unloading of that product. Okay, and again, back to the documentation. So those are the sections that I believe probably are going to be more focused to ensure that those practices are strong, are verifiable, are verified, and then they have the documentation within 24 hours to ensure that you can meet not only SQF, but you can meet a regulatory inspection that, if you should be so lucky to have it within, the next year or so. The next one is calibration. And the calibration equipment becomes important because, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the focus of the FDA is very, very strong on those products that require temperature control for safety. So ensuring that equipment that you're going to use as part of SQF, that you have to use, that is properly calibrated, and all the monitoring activities is going to be critical. Not only that, but in addition to that, it's going to be critical that you understand that becomes part of your inspection. So it is in a way that would be easier for you to release that information than an inspection. Okay, in section 12.2a, calibration will be one of those processes and procedures that I believe would be very important during an inspection to ensure that the inspector feels comfortable you're meeting that part of the regulation. The next one is personal hygiene and welfare. And this is going to specifically apply if your product is open or exposed. The FDA targets bulk foods that they are shipped in bulk, but any other product that may be open, it also becomes available. You're going to have to make sure your practices for infectious disease of personnel or personnel with exposed cuts, sores, lesions. All of those practices, all those standard operating procedures, all of that documentation needs to be available. And then they're also going to be looking very strong for hand washing if you're transporting at any point any product that will be considered exposed. And then the documentation records that you're verifying, that is verifiable, and you're verifying all of those during the inspection is going to be important. The next one would be, of course, this is the most important, 12.6, storage and transportation. And it goes to the heart of the new FDA law about temperature control, okay? Effective operation performance of cold and chilled storage facilities, sufficient refrigeration capacity, temperature monitor equipment, and this one, loading and unloading docks shall be designed to protect during loading and unloading, okay? So those are, again, not only documented to meet the SQF requirements, but documented to meet the FDA requirements are going to be very, very important. The other ones is hazardous chemicals and toxic substances. This is a part of the contamination that the new rules are also focusing on. Okay, so how are you doing your risk analysis to ensure that this is not going to be a problem to your staff, your product, your packaging, you're handling the equipment in the areas. That risk analysis, I believe, will be part of the inspection questions that you're going to get. Where 2L651, where goods are held on temporary or overflow conditions, something very common in during some parts of the year. Those are also now subject to inspection, and they will be able to meet if they have any of the foods that are under the regulatory purview. Then you're going to have a risk analysis. So you will not be able just to go in and put it someplace else. You're going to have to forethought where those products are. If you have an overflow or you have a lot of product, where you're going to put it, and then you're going to have the equipment. You're going to have the practices. You're going to have the documentations, or every place that those foods were put, even for a short period of time. And of course, your practices during loading, transportation, unloading. Whether it's you or whether you use third parties, contract people to do the loading and unloading. And then if you do use those, then you release that information, and then they accept the responsibilities to maintain all of that documentation, all of those practices of verifying the temperature, the cleaning, the sanitation, and all of that of the units. Again, same thing, 12767 loading in the vehicles, the inspection. It is not, in my opinion, it's not about doing the inspection, it's about the documentation that those inspections were conducted that could present a significant challenge to operations. The larger the operation, the more that this will become a challenge, because the amount of records that are going to be necessary now to maintain can be significant. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of note here that I got to hurry up a little bit. Transport. Storage and transport, again, refrigerated units to maintain the food at required temperatures. This is the entire focus, the main focus of the law. So how the temperatures are going to be done, but not also that, but that you agree, if you're receiving the product or you're shipping the product with your carrier, that this is the way you're going to document it, and with your receiver, that they agree that that's the way they want it documented. And remember, the receiver can always request that they want to see that the product was handled at the proper temperature when the product was shipped through us. So how is that going to be done? Is that going to be electronic? Is that going to be on-site? I mean, there's a number of such, but that has to be agreed on by all parties in order to be able to meet the intent of the law. Again, unload is the same thing. And then last part, so that I can have a few minutes for comments. When it comes to the transportation rules, they're actually very simple. But the big change, so the big shift here is activity-based. Shippers, carriers, loaders, and receivers. Covers food transported intrastate and interstate by railroad. Focuses on temperature control and avoiding contamination. Is flexible in approach to temperature monitoring, and doesn't require a carrier to demonstrate temperature control to the receiver for every shipment, but only on a request from the shipper or the receiver. Imposes new stop-sale distribution of food when conditions may render food unsafe, which we talked about it, and that's going to be something that's going to be has to be very closely watched by the industry in those interpretations, how that's done and how that is implemented, and what kind of documentation is going to be done. And of course, the new record requirements are going to be something that the industry is going to have to figure out how to do it in an efficient and effective manner. From the SQF certification, good news, it covers all of the elements of the rule. There's nothing in this rule that, from my perspective, is not going to be covered, so you are going to be in a good place, except you still need to pay attention to the different activities, and you're going to have to think through if you, on the different circumstances or at different locations, you have different activities that you give to somebody else, and you have the contracts to verify that, and if that party, whether it's a third party or a logistics company or another company, has agreed to take that responsibility, and how those contracts are going to be written. It's going to be something that you really need to think long and hard. Requires written agreements from parties who perform the different activities, like I said, and could give regulatory access to the policies, SOP, contracts, and other sensitive documents. This is an area that I think as an industry we need to think very long and hard. What are you comfortable giving? And if you're not comfortable, you perhaps, and this is just my thought, you can make it an attachment to a contract. You can make it some sort that you can separate for the information that may be either proprietary in nature or sensitive, or that you don't want to release to the government. And finally, the larger you are, the more complexity you're going to have, because then the requirement for document access is going to be significant, where you will need to provide that information, at least from the read of the rule, within 24 hours. So you're a large organization and they ask you for records of a shipment that happened 3 or 4 months ago. That could be a significant challenge for a lot of companies that may or may not have the systems to be able to do that. And if you rely on paper, then you have 24 hours to produce it, especially if you move the paper to another outside your building. So that could be something very, very interesting to do. With that, I'm sorry it went a little bit long, but I think I wanted to give a little bit of time for questions. Rick, thank you for listening. I'm looking forward to the questions. Rick?
Okay, great.
What do you think?
Great. Thank you, Jorge. Really appreciate it. It was a great presentation. We've got several questions coming in from our audience. And first, regarding this FSMA, the final rule that was just finalized, is there any time frame that FDA has put out in terms of when they expect implementation, when companies are going to be liable? I mean, we have specifically a question that we're a distributed manufacturer with annual sales of excess of $1 million. And when can we expect implementation or inspection?
Okay. According to the rule, effective date is April of next year. So you have 11 months to comply with all of it, unless you fall under one of the exceptions, right? And I believe from what you said that you probably won't. Okay. If you follow one of the, if you're a smaller company, then you have 2 years to do it. So you have 11 months to comply. So that's the very first thing. And that's why it's important, like I said, to make sure that you start looking at how are you going to document, how are you going to provide that information. But technically, the FDA in April, I think it was the 8th, so in April 9 of 2017, can walk into your operation and expect to be in full compliance. That said, the FDA has been very, very vocal. They said that they plan to do education before enforcement. So they're going to give an ease into the regulations. So the thinking is that you are going to have a period of time where it's going to be able to not be as forceful on their enforcement part, but more on the education part to make sure that they feel comfortable with your compliance, with how you're documenting compliance, so that you don't get surprised. They haven't really given a timeline on how long that period is going to be, and you will have to make the internal decision whether you want to wait until then to start feeling that your compliance is appropriate. My recommendation, as somebody that has played different roles in the industry, is that you start really looking at compliance now, and as you start developing and looking at the biggest barriers where there is access to records or how you're going to separate critical information in contracts or in other key documents to it, that you monitor the 3 areas where the FDA is already saying that they're going to be providing information over the next 11 months. The first one is the Q&A. I gave you in my presentation the place where you can actually ask questions. Will this meet the intent of the law? And those questions and answers will be answered for everybody. So that's the first place that I would go. Have somebody ask a similar question and be able to do that, right? The second one is they're actually putting together a guidance document how to comply, which is expected to come in the next few months. Okay? The law is going to be the law, but the compliance or the interpretations are going to be critical. So pay attention to that as you develop your policies and procedures, as you start looking at all of the questions we just mentioned, all of the areas that we just mentioned, be able to do that. And the third one is look to your organizations. I've already been working with a couple, and I know some organizations are developing guidelines or best practices. SQF is going to be able to provide with that. If you're an SQF, you probably already have 99% of the things. It's just a matter of making sure that you have it at the scale and scope that is going to require. But I think there is one, FMI is another one that's working. There are a number of organizations that are trying to help their members make sure that they have the right information to comply, in the least, with the least possible impact to their operations. Does that make sense, Rick?
Yeah, it does, and that's assuming you've been manufacturing and you don't have any issues. If you've had a recall, it'll be interesting to see how FDA reacts now that 6 rules are finalized. And even if they aren't just doing a routine inspection, but now if they're investigating a recall, I think it can get a lot more complicated. Do you agree?
Yes, I think if you're going to be a recall, you're going to be looking for all of those things. But technically, you cannot really expect it to comply if it's not before that date.
Okay.
So they will be looking for it. And the good news is, from my time in the industry, a lot of these things are already there. They're just not in the form or format that you can feel comfortable. So, yes, during a recall, not only on the recall, but under the food ordinance investigation.
Okay.
This is information they're going to be looking for. So could they come and ask for it earlier? Yes. Now, remember what I said at the beginning. This is just one of the many layers of the regulations. We have 6. There's one yet to come. So if the product that is on the recall, if the product is under another one of the laws, like sample produce, or another product that is like coming from a foreign supplier verification program or preventive control, that will have also an impact. So the Safe Food Transportation Act is just one that plays with the other ones. So don't just rely on this one. Look at what your operation is, because you're likely to be impacted by 2, 3, or more of the 7 rules. That's what I was talking about when I said, making it activity-based makes it a little more challenging, because then if you're a distributor, that's all you have to do. No. If you do all of these things, you are now liable for a lot more than you were in the past, or at least expected to comply. Does that make sense, Rick?
Sure. I'm going to try and combine 2 questions into one for the sake of time. I'm going to start with, we're producing, packaging, and loading and shipping all from one facility to a receiving hub, which is our end customer. We plan on loading into collapsible bins and using them as shipping containers to our end users within cold-chilled trucks. Does this become a problem when the produce is not in a sealed container by itself? And then in addition to that, a separate question came in. Can you define not completely enclosed container and give some examples of these foods?
Okay, so the first part is a lot of the products like produce are not going to be in a container. So what basically the rules, the combination of rules is you have to make a risk analysis, and you have to make sure that the product is protected from the environment, from any chemicals, from any cross-contamination. It is from other foods or from other products, like if you had before a shipment of products that would be allergens, they have an allergen something, then you have to do the cleaning, demonstrate that you clean it before you put a product there. Those are the things that you're going to have to now not only have the processes to do that, but the verification that it was done before your product is going to be ready to eat. That makes sense? So that's the very first thing. So what products are you going to be doing? But you're going to have to do a risk analysis. So the products and the risk analysis against all of those is temperature control, cross-contamination, against chemicals, against allergens, all of those things. And then you're going to look what is the packaging that I have. In a lot of cases, a complete closed packaging is, for example, a can of product that you're not even subject to this rule. If you're shelf stable, you don't have to worry about it. But if it's a product that is time temperature control for safety, then you follow the rule, right? Then you do have to. It's got to be temperature control under safety. And the other thing, don't forget, is it's not under USDA requirements. So if it's already like a chicken product or something like that, it's already in the USDA. You have to follow USDA. So it becomes a little bit more complex, but yes, you're gonna have to look at the product and how the products are shipped to you, or how you ship those products to your customers. I can see how some shipments or some I hope these shipments, I hope it's not businesses, ship more towards just products that are non-temperature controlled, because then they don't have to meet all these requirements. Right, and then the temperature control, then you segregate them and you bunch them into ones where you're going to have to do, the ensuring that the truck is clean, that it has been cleaned with, what was there before, and then there is contamination with allergens and the temperature is there and stuff like that. So you might have to do that as the business practice. That may be one of the results of this, one of the consequences of this year rule. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. How much time do we have left? I know you have a hard stop.
I think we have 7 more minutes. So
okay.
maybe we have one more question?
Sure. Okay. We are an animal feed manufacturer bringing in raw commodities and shipping mixed feed products. Do we need to have a documented washout, clean-out form for each truck that is loading and unloading?
So animal feed is covered under this. And depending on what is in your animal feed, that's a very broad term. But if there is anything that one of the loads can contaminate into the other, yes, then you'll have to document that you have taken the controls to make sure there is no contamination from one load that may have, I don't know if you bring in, no, that would not be good. Some products that may be raw animal parts or some sort of that, and then the other one is not, it's just grains. I'm just making this up, but there will be a cross contamination from one to the other. Then you're going to have to do all of that because animal feed is part of human food and animal food. It's part of the rule.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. You have time for one more?
Well, it looks like we have one more then.
Okay. When the rule uses exposed as a food definition, what degree of protection is required? For example, is a pre-forwarded craft bag in a cardboard box sufficiently not exposed, or would a vapor barrier be required?
That's a very, very good question. Now, the way that the rule was released is they're going to give a lot more examples of what they expect will be acceptable or not acceptable. It's about the packaging, but you got to remember what the way I would look at it if I was a regulator trying to implement this, or when I was a regulator, the goal is temperature control. Does the food need to be at temperature control, right? And if it's exposed for contamination from the environment, from chemicals, from something else, right, other products or other things. If the packaging is protecting the food from all of those risks, it's probably not going to be an issue with the food. But if it needs to be temperature controlled, it has a packaging that doesn't allow it to be protected, then they will be covered, and then you're going to have to do all of the practice and documentations to ensure that it happens right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
great.
But again, the FDA, I'm saying, was very clear that they will continue to provide examples in a guidance document that will clarify a little bit more of what they mean by enclosed container and what they mean by contamination and what they mean by records and all of those things. So we really need to watch out for that. It's not out yet. So what you're hearing is just my interpretation based on what I read and my industry experience. But we're going to get a lot more. So without panicking at this point, I would start looking at what are my risks, what is my packaging, and start making determinations whether I'm going to be needed to cover it or not, and then look to the Q&A and the FDA website that is in my presentation, and then you should be able to discern not, or if not, issue the question to the FDA. When they released this rule, they said that they will answer all questions, which is very, very nice, but expects, time to do that. They're running about between 4 and 6 weeks to answer a question. If you do it now, when we have 11 months before compliance, I think we're in a good place. If you wait until January of next year, then you may be in a different place.
Sure.
Right, Rick?
Okay, terrific. Well, my suggestion to the audience at this point is to write down Jorge's email address because there were several other questions that unfortunately are going to go unanswered today. Also, on foodsafetytech.com, there is a contact us button, and if for whatever reason you still have additional questions or somehow don't write down Jorge's email address, and if you go there, I get all of those submissions, and I can forward anything over to Jorge.
Yeah, and I'll do my best to answer them. If not, I can give you a link to the parts of the rule or the parts of the Q&A that they already provided. so you can see what they're saying and they're thinking, and then we both learn from that. Okay?
Terrific. Mm-hmm.